introduce my panel. I'll introduce my panel. So first on coming is the fabulous Julie Bindel. The equally fabulous Cath Leng from the BBC. You'll all know Simon Edge of his brilliant satire book, Simon. And finally, Ben Appel, who's come all the way from the States to be with us today. Thank you, panel. Now, this session is going to be a celebration. It's a celebration of whistleblowers, and in particular, the whistleblowers in our media outlets. The media outlets that are meant to uphold the principles of impartiality are newspapers, our broadcasters, and our publishers. On our panel, we have 4 of the very courageous people who have sounded the alarm through their newspaper columns, TV newsrooms, and books. But before we get to the panel, I'd just like to point out that everyone in this room is a whistleblower. Every one of you. And the mere act of coming to this conference is an act of bravery and defiance, as we all know how hard it is our opponents work to shut us up, to insist on no debate. Now, it's a well-known truth that evil can only succeed if the majority remains silent, if the majority chooses to be bystanders and refuse to speak up when they see something happening that they know is wrong. So this session is about all of us, and I'm going to ask for another round of applause for anyone who's ever been to an LGB Alliance conference. So now to my panel, let me introduce Julie Bindel, you all know, a prolific columnist, lifelong feminist and campaigner, and one of the very first people to sound the alarm 20 years ago. Cath Leng, who's been challenging gender ideology at the BBC, God help her, for around 8 years. She did this first as a senior journalist and now outside the BBC as a major operator in scene in journalism. Thank you. Simon Edge, author of brilliant books, including The End of the World is Flat and the brilliant sequel In the Beginning. Simon is also a publisher at one of the few independent publishers that print gender-critical books. And finally, Ben Appel, writer and journalist, who has travelled from the US to tell us what's happening with the gender-critical movement over there during the toxic atmosphere of the presidential election. So we've got lots to talk about. We're trying to fit it all in the few minutes I've been given. I'm going to ask questions from the audience after all 4 have spoken. So if you could just think of your any questions as they speak and note them down, that would be great. So first of all, Julie, I often hear people name you as one of the first columnists who started writing about this issue. Can you tell us just briefly what caused you to become involved in the gender ideology debate so early on before most people, including me, ever noticed there was a problem?
Well, just to say that the very first book written from a feminist perspective on this issue was by Janice Raymond, The Transsexual Empire, and others had spoken out about it in their books. Sheila Jeffries, for example, Germaine Greer had caused a major kerfuffle at her university because of trans ideology there. And the only reason that I spoke out about it in the first instance is because I'm a feminist campaigner against male violence towards women and girls. So why would I not speak out when I heard that Vancouver Rape Relief, a brilliant organisation, had been tied up in 10 years of horrendous litigation over in Canada, or Tranada, as we refer to it, by a trans-identified male who wanted to counsel rape and sexual assault victims and survivors. And when he was told very politely that he could maybe be on the fundraising subgroup or something like that, waiting in the wings were the Canadian version of Liberty, one of the human rights men's rights organisations, obviously. And they just embarked upon litigation, which actually throughout the time that I've known these women, it's never really gone away. They won, they lost, then they won, then they lost, then they won. And were it not for the brilliant feminist lawyers out there that did the case pro bono, and the generosity of the feminist public and other supporters, they would have gone under. And that was the point.
Yeah.
So I started speaking out about it because it meant that all of our hard-won rights, that were tenuous enough as it was, would be lost, and we'd end up with men in women's prisons and all the other spaces where we need men not to be. And the reason why we set them up, obviously, is because of the danger to girls and women, and also the sexual harassment, not just danger, but the pain in the fucking arse. Stuff that we've got to put up with.
Thank you.
So,
Can edit. We can do an edit before it's broadcast. Just getting on to the media side of it, though. You were writing for The Guardian as a freelancer. Now, something really badly happened. You were writing and it all stopped. What happened?
Yes, it was a
Guardian?
terrible accident. So I got into journalism in 2000. It wasn't my first career. I didn't go to journalism school. I started writing op-eds as a feminist campaigner about the cases that we were dealing with, and had good editors and learned to write, basically. And ironically, it was Catherine Viner, who now edits The Guardian, who gave me my first big break at The Guardian. And really, it was, were it not for Kath, I probably wouldn't have gone into journalism, and I definitely wouldn't have started writing for The Guardian. But I did a lot across all the sections. And then in 2004, I wrote a column on Vancouver rape relief and how terrible it was for those women. And it was in Julie Birchall's slot. Note to self, never write in Julie Birchall's slot, right? So at the time, she was a columnist for Weekend magazine, and I wrote a piece that basically ranted about the nonsense of men claiming to be women. And it was the first article I'd written on this issue that went online. And the trans activists had started to use listservs, and it was at the very beginning of a form of social media in 2004. And they came after me like none of the misogynists had ever come after me before. And they always had come after me. They'd come after all of us that mentioned little inconveniences like rape and murder of women by men. But this time, the Liberals, of course, all were on their side, right? And so this was taken up by The Guardian as a serious complaint. There was a Reader's Editor column on it. Catherine Viner vigorously defended me. And it was in the old days of The Guardian having some morals and some kind of liberal sensibility. But that was it. And then from then on, wherever I went, whether it was overseas or in the UK, whatever I was doing, and it was 9 times out of 10 about rape, domestic violence, child abuse, prostitution, they came after me. There were pickets, there were windows banged and blue-fringed idiots standing outside.
And The Guardian just lost it after that, because I think they lost every one of their feminist writers or some stage.
Yeah, but it took some time.
Yeah.
I mean, under the previous editor, you know, he robustly, I mean, I was never a big fan, but he robustly defended the liberal values that, interestingly, feminists have always railed against, because it's the Liberals that get us into trouble with all of this even playing field in many ways, and being upset when we say, yes, actually, all men, and they get very upset about this. So it was fine for a few years, and then it wasn't, because what happened was they started to see this movement emerging. Social media had kicked off, and they started to hire trans-identified men as writers. And what they did, because they're aggressive, misogynistic monsters, is that they started massively complaining about any of us, whether it was me, Suzanne, Hadley a bit further down the line, that wrote anything critical whatsoever about gender ideology, and they won. And they won the readership, and the readers all thought it was another Section 28 and another gay liberation issue, and that they started to capitulate. And the first sign of this happening, and where I knew that there would be no coming back from it, and I was still writing for them, was in, I think, 2013, Julie Burchill wrote a piece in The Observer. It was quite a nasty piece. She probably went too far, which is Julie Burchill's job, right? But she was right, the essence of it. Unfortunately, it was in defence of me and Suzanne Moore, as if we didn't have enough trouble already. So The Observer published the piece. There was a massive trans activist mob outside of the Guardian and Observer building. They went berserk with loud hailers, and they were really aggressive, and they took the article down. First time in history. And that marked the end of free speech and liberal values at The Guardian.
Oh, what a story. Last question to you, Julie, is did you lose work and friends because of your activity?
I was lucky because I already had an established reputation doing feminist activism and campaigning. What I lost was the opportunity to do work that isn't paid work, talking to young people, talking to students, community groups about men's violence, about how to counter it, talking to young women in universities about porn and the harms of pornography. So all the stuff that was much more dear to my heart. My income was okay. What I lost was huge, which would have been career-changing, opportunities to, I mean, awards are shit, but to win awards, which I was just removed from the lists as soon as they kicked off. Big literary festivals, publishing deals, all of it went. And that's happened to many of us in this room as well. But income-wise, I was lucky. A lot of people lose their income at the same time, which obviously makes it way worse.
Thank you, and thank you for everything you've done, Julie. It's really appreciated. And now next, Cath Leng. Cath, a lot of your journalistic career was at BBC. Maybe not. Yeah. When did you first notice that there was a problem getting gender-critical stories covered at your workplace?
So I'm just going to add to Julie's there. Yeah. One thing she did lose as well, she was then never called. If there was a story about, and we used to do live, so all those calls just stopped. So there is no official blacklist at the BBC, but Julie's never going to be called on stories about male violence, trauma, rape crisis. That's a big platform that Julie lost. So it was about 2015, 2016. Victoria Derbyshire was doing a lot of trans stuff at the time. I knew about it, and I was fully sex realist from the beginning, but I thought it was extremely niche and ridiculous. And I didn't get into it through feminism, it was through journalism. So when a story knocked on my door with stories about Chelsea Manning, and we were suddenly required to call him she, and and there was a man called Claire Derbyshire who murdered his father, and we described him as a daughter all day. And so it wasn't really feminism, it was just I was standing there at my desk saying, this isn't true, we can't say it. Why are we saying this? It's just not true. And I couldn't get beyond that. I wasn't experienced in the subject. I didn't have the internal resources to make a case. I thought it was enough of a case to say this simply isn't true. And
you were the chief writer on the BBC News 24.
Yes, I was the chief writer from 2010 to about 2011 to about 2018, and then I became like a senior journalist, which goes in the gallery.
And in the chief writer at News 24, it was your job to ensure that everything broadcast was fair and accurate, but you were overruled when it came to gender critical issues.
Yes. I mean, this was, naively, I thought, if we say that Chelsea Manning is female, it's going to come back on me. Everybody's going to complain and I'm going to be the one that's blamed. Little did I know that this was now the received narrative. So I objected, I stood there, but I'd written the intro appropriately and the Astons appropriately and accurately, and then somebody came running around the newsroom saying, change it all, and there was a big editorial huddle, and it was changed, and I was helpless. I was absolutely helpless. I was kind of ejected from my role. And the same with Claire Derbyshire. We called him a female, and so that's when I started looking into it. Why was the BBC doing this? Discovered the Style Guide, which mandates self-identification, discovered what had happened with All About Trans back in 2011, 2012, 2013, interactions with editorial executives, online editors, drama commissioner, just a whole lot. I mean, everybody. And then we realised what a mammoth task we had, trying to dismantle all of that.
And it was around 2018 when you decided to take a more radical approach to get the attention of your bosses in your Twitter activity.
So I had an anonymous account, and I kept 2016 to 18-19 was a crazy time at the BBC. Everything was so trans affirmative. It was incredible. There was no, like, we didn't do the Maya Forstater story, but we did I was sacked for being trans. We didn't do puberty blockers being named as not irreversible anymore, but we did endless stories about puberty blockers, waiting lists, Jennifer's transgender struggles, all of this. So I'd ask for meetings and email people and said, can we chat? Nothing was changing. So I thought, I'll go on Twitter and I had to find people as well. There were a couple of us working together, but I had to find other people and make a group. So I thought, there's no way. I'll have to go on Twitter and come out. And I thought the biggest weapon, like, your enemy's biggest weapon is your own. So they would complain about everything endlessly. And so I thought, if I'm being ignored at the BBC, I can use that complaining power, because then they'll complain about me and my managers will be forced to meet me. They'll be forced to read what I've written and forced to listen to me. They'll be forced, because they'll have to. So sure enough, there was just like endless meetings with line managers. Some of them were protective and were like, "Do you know what you're doing here?" But there was no choice. You had to just carry on.
And just tell us the story about when you noticed that cis was being used internally.
Yeah. So cis was starting to be. Cis was like is not. I'd been told we're not using cis at the BBC, but it wasn't kind of written down anywhere. And it started to creep into sort of internal comms, like a bit of copy, internal copy, or an email or something on the diary. So I thought, if I complain, it's going to get nowhere. So I wrote a thread on Twitter. So I wrote this thread on Twitter. It was completely factual. It was like, this is what cis means. It was a professional analysis, and I thought, I'm going to leave that there. And so within an hour, I was told to take it down, and I said, I'll take it down if you can tell me what's wrong with it. And obviously, there's nothing wrong with it. And nothing untrue about it. And they said, no, it breaches guidelines. And so I said, well, tell me how. Line by line, tell me. Nobody could tell me how, and nobody to this day has told me what was wrong with it. It was all completely true. So then So then that was a disciplinary, and the grievance outcome that came back, that was awful. There were more disciplinaries after that. But the interesting thing that came out of that disciplinary was a line in the outcome which said, accuracy and impartiality are not the same thing. You may be entirely accurate, but they may give an impression that you're not impartial. And so what this says is basically, because the facts lie on one side, they land on one side of this debate. They land on one side. There is one side with facts and one side with counterfactual. But because the facts land on one side, you can't articulate them. Instead of saying, oh, these are the facts, let's put them in a fact check and let's make them the default, it's like, you can't say them. And we saw it again with Justin Webb, who you probably all remember, when he said trans sportswomen are male, and it wasn't about a specific person, so there's no privacy invasion or no personal insult, it was just a generalisation, and that was deemed to be like a foot fault, a disciplinary kind of a penalty that was wrong, and that was a complaint that was fast-tracked. So this is how, it's like you can't say the facts because they're accurate, not despite the fact that they're accurate. So this was very troublesome.
And we've now got BBC Verify, isn't that? It's good. I'm going to ask you about it, but it's strangely, this is it's Orwellian.
Reputationally, it's
so I'm going to have to move on because I've talked to you all day, but you decided to leave because you just didn't think you're going to get...
Yeah, so there were two more disciplinaries. There was a disciplinary about LGB Alliance.
Oh,
that was
that's right.
Yeah, I put LGB Alliance on the ticker. And two people, it's like a little quote about monkeypox, two people asked me to take it down. They just said, I've had a text from a friend, can you take it off? It's like, I know people who go through, most people here have probably been through a stage or two of the BBC complaints process, and it's arduous and it's terrible. So it's just got a text from a friend and you're going to make me take it down? Yeah, that's not happening. So then that also, I was disciplined for that. And then I was disciplined for Hard Talk. So the Hard Talk programme, the presenter said trans people are at greater risk of suicide, so I raised an alert about that. And they did have to apologise for saying that, but they still disciplined me anyway. So by that time, in 20, I thought, I'm kind of done. And I'm a blockage to progress at the BBC. Hopefully they will make more progress with that.
I know there was one final thing you wanted to say, because we all get so frustrated. You write to the BBC and complain, and you get this insulting cut and paste reply, but you think it's important.
Yes, they're always counted and they're published. Complain again when you get fobbed off. Take it again to stage 3 when you get, which is the executive complaints unit, and then take it to Ofcom. Keep complaining, because the news consumer is the biggest weapon. Like, more than internal pressure, the news consumer is the biggest. It's clicks, scrolling, and inside the newsroom, I'll be very brief, inside the BBC newsroom is the dotted around screens which have most read, and they've got numbers, how many people have clicked on the page, and how much engagement there is. They monitor it all the time. And somebody on a live desk will say, oh, that's the most read story. Maybe we should get a live on that. So engage, like click, engage, scroll, because it's not invisible. It's all seen.
Well, that's really, really good advice. Thank you. I mean, it's such a great insight into the BBC, because it's a mystery to most of us when we don't get complaints. So we really thank you for that. And thank you once again for being so brave and so consistent. And I'm going to ask for another round of applause.
I will just say, before moving on to
Simon, of course.
Thank you. The women, the people at the BBC who are still doing this, they have my heart, they're still doing it.
Oh.
And it's hard for them, but they still are.
Oh.
That's it.
We're all very grateful. On a lighter note, Simon, when our brave journalists here have exposed gender ideology with hard-hitting stories and commentary, you do it by brilliant satire, if I may say so. The book, The End of the World is Flat, is a satire on a certain charity. I'm just going to briefly try and summarise the book. It's a charity, if you haven't read it, you should. A charity runs out of issues and cash. So it follows the money and decides to push the ideology that it is racist to say the world is round. So they call anyone who disagrees with them Turks, true earth-rejecting globularists, or YERF, I think I've got this wrong, young earth-rejecting fascists, is that right?
That's in the second one.
That's the second one, yes. And if you haven't read Simon's books, you really have to. So, Simon, how did you come up with the idea of The End of the World is Flat, please?
Well, I was, for a long time, for 20 years, I was a journalist, and I stopped being a journalist in 2014 when I took redundancy from the Daily Express. And having got involved in this issue, there were, it seemed to me that there wasn't any great need, with people like Julie and Joe Bartosh, who's here, and other people who were writing really good, making this a specialist issue, writing very, very good freelance journalism. I thought there was no great need for me to stick my oar in, but there was something which I could do, because I had I'd published already 4 satirical novels, and I also worked for the publisher who published me, and I had got heavily involved on Twitter in this issue, and I had a background as I'd been the last editor of Capital Gay. And it occurred to me that I did have a unique opportunity to take this issue on in satirical fiction. And partly because I had a bit of a head for it, that I knew how to assemble satirical novels, but also because this kind of book would not have been published, I think, by a mainstream publisher, but because I was part of the publisher, then I knew I could get it published. And the idea really, what I wanted to do, people talk about let's have less heat and light. And I thought one way you could do that would be to write allegorically. So rather than have characters from the real world who trans characters pitted against gay characters and lesbian characters, blah, 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 let's transpose the argument and let's imagine that, say, it suddenly becomes really unacceptable socially to say that the world is round, globular, because people who want to believe that it's flat have just achieved ascendancy. And what I wanted to do really was just to work out, it was like a kind of intellectual game, but a parlor game, just to work out if you have decided that you want to convince the entire world that the Earth is flat, how would you actually go about doing it? And so the novel, at least to some extent, I had to learn about bots and things, and it was all about harnessing progressive forces. That's why it got into the narrative. I have people hiring academics, tame academics, who can construct a bonkers but just about plausible narrative, which identifies the global South with poverty, and therefore somehow to talk about to talk about a global world is somehow entrenching the values of North v South. It's nonsense. It sounds nonsense the way I'm recounting it, but I've managed to find a way to make it just about plausible, that it can sink in, and because people are tribal, that if you find the kind of people who say who are standing up for this new way of thinking or these new mantras, that if people see people whom they respect saying this kind of thing, they will repeat it too, which clearly is what has happened in the real world.
No, it was really cleverly done, and the books will be for sale. You've got two here. We're unashamedly publishing the books, but I really strongly recommend it. So really, really hilarious stuff, and so cleverly done, actually, very ingeniously done, and very believable as well. Just going on to the publishing side, you're a publisher, and so many GC writers, Hannah Barnes, Helen Joyce, it was endless, really find it difficult to get very good books published. Why is the publishing industry so scared of this issue, do you think?
The publishing industry, by and large, is scared of the people who work for it and who service it in the retail trade. Publishing is really badly paid. So is working in Waterstones. By and large, merchant bankers, people on the lower rungs of banking, do not get particularly exercised by identity politics. If they do, you don't hear about it. Why? Because they're on a pathway which will lead to enormous riches. Whether it's ever conscious, I don't know. But in the liberal professions, where there just isn't any money, even the people at the top of publishing are not earning very much money, it's like it's a consolation prize. We're not going to pay you very much, even though you're going to be highly skilled. Therefore, we will give extra weight to your opinions so that you can feel that what you're doing is worthwhile. So if you then have a cohort, a generation of people who've got extremely strong views, they genuinely do have the ability or the potential to bring, not quite bring the presses to a halt, but you obviously need cooperation. to do a big enterprise like publishing a book. And what we have seen is that the people at the top of publishing are extremely reluctant to say, to do anything which they think will upset their junior members of staff. And they're right, often it will upset their junior members of staff. The same in the Waterstones chain, where people, where the you know, people who, most people who work in retail don't have degrees, I don't think. Virtually everybody who works in Waterstones does have a degree. They're not very highly paid. They are expected to read tons of their books. They're expected to love books and have a lot of interaction with customers. So if, again, you have a generation of people coming out of universities with liberal arts degrees, then what they think about the world actually has quite an impact on how they're doing their jobs.
Because it probably affects arts, theatres,
Exactly.
academia, all those kind of arts.
But the important point is that, you know, there is another set of people. There's the authors, obviously, nobody cares about us. But there is also another set of people, namely the readers. And, you know, there is no correlation. Clearly, there are some people in this in the generation I'm talking about. Obviously, quite a lot of them read a lot of books. They are very, very well served for the books they want to read. But the publishing is not serving people who don't want to read highly politicized material that that's gone through the filter of identity politics. And when we published, we were told we were committing commercial suicide. It was a horrible process because of the threats we received and the internal rows. But when we published Graham Linehan's memoir, Tough Crowd, there was a news story on Pop Bitch, which was then picked up in that great Journal of Record Pink News, which said we had sold 300 copies at a time when we had a stack of, I think, 4,000 books boxed up and ready to go to the post. Actually, it was a nightmare for us, because if you're a tiny operation, suddenly selling 4,000 books in a week is a strategic, yeah, it's a good nightmare to have, but nevertheless, it was difficult. But so the point really is that there was, you know, celebrity sells, even cancelled celebrity sells. There was a huge appetite for people to read Graham's book, which gave the lie to the idea that we were committing commercial suicide.
Thank you, Sam. Such a great insight. And finally, Ben Appel. Now, Ben, you're a writer and journalist based in New York. Now, the US seems to be in an even worse situation than we are here. Could you just give us it's very polarised, just an overview of what the publishing newspaper journalist atmosphere is like over there?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's changing. It's kind of like where all of the mainstream publications have been captured, so new ones have been sprouting up. The Free Press, Barry Weiss's publication that started on Substack, her and Nellie Bowles, it really has taken off, and the readership has really grown, and people are just so hungry for the truth to be written that they're willing to subscribe and pay for different outlets. But there is movement at the New York Times, the Washington Post even, where they came up against legacy orgs like GLAAD a couple years ago that, you know, put a van outside that said, you know, the science is settled, is what they said, talking about puberty blockers and all of that, and delivered this letter of demand saying, you know, you must start reporting this way, and you must hire this many trans people by this date, and you must publish this many articles written by these, you know, and this is from GLAAD, which is, you know, a reputable organization. Then, of course, it's signed by all these know-nothing celebrities, you know, who, you know, signed on to this, and they didn't back down. They said, the New York Times didn't back down. They said, we have a different agenda than you. We have a different role. We are here to report, and you are an advocacy organization, you're an activist organization, and we have different goals. And that was a big deal for them not to cave, I think.
And then actually they ran an exposure story about the head, the woman who was head of GLAAD.
Yeah.
And
that was more recent, right?
So that was about corruption and her spending and...
Yeah, it was really delicious, actually. Because, you know, it's like they have this whole campaign to, you know, put a muzzle on these reporters that were putting out more honest... I mean, believe me, like, they weren't completely unbiased, but they were getting a little bit... Like, actually acknowledging that there is a debate about, you know, so-called sex changes for kids, that there's like, oh, there are people that disagree with this. So I forgot.
So it was I'm trying to remember the woman's name, but she was spending tons of money, flights, first-class hotels, and they did a really good expose of her. And
all of the money that I think she gets paid about $800,000 a year.
Didn't she buy a chandelier?
Like she bought a chandelier.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Yes,
You know, with Sarah Kate Ellis, what's really important to know about her is that she comes from Condé Nast and comes from the publishing world where she was in charge of marketing. So she knew that GLAAD was really struggling financially when she came along. And again, yeah, it should have shut down like a lot of organizations had done or should have done.
It's our version of Stonewall, really, isn't it, GLAAD?
What's that?
GLAAD is sort of Stonewall type.
Correct. Yeah, and it's all about accelerating acceptance through media and visual representation. But really, what they've become about is controlling the narrative, and they actually use that language. Like they have consultants that go out and meet with Broadway producers and TV writers and movie writers, and they say, oh, we need to talk. This is how you must speak and write and represent these different ideas and so on. So but she comes from this world where she knew that it's all about corporate, sponsorship and getting people to understand how lucrative investing in this is. And that she openly would say she was obsessed with social media and monitoring what the young people, she completely is just, let's give it to them. They're leading this, and that's the way forward. And so it's really crazy people that are running the show.
And I just want to touch briefly on the health care issue and trans affirming care, because we had lunch yesterday, and it was that brought you into this, what's happening to the kids, and it's what brought me into it. But it's the Wild West in America with the clinics. I mean, it really seems like they've allowed to do whatever they want to do. Give us a bit overview of trans health care in America.
Well, so there's a lot of, Jamie Reed is here today. She's a whistleblower from the Wash U Clinic in Missouri, and she and I, her coming out and writing an expose, which was, 2023, I think it was, right? February? So not long ago, but in the Free Press, which, published her story. That was a big watershed moment, I think, because she was this gay woman that was married to a person who at the time identified as transgender, and she had worked for years in a gender-affirming clinic for youth, and she was blowing the whistle and saying that people are being harmed. So that was a big watershed moment, and I think that it was one of those things where in the media it's almost like, how do journalists, they want to get the story, they want to break the news. Why are they allowing all of these up and coming or secondary publications to get all of these major stories? And I think that now they are catching up and they're realizing, and I think that's why the New York Times is shifting. I think it really takes people doing that. So anyway, we're a for-profit healthcare system in the U.S. I think that's a big difference. It's very unregulated. It really is generally all about profit. And so, state by state. So red states, conservative states, Republican states are outlawing these practices, and they're being challenged, and now There's, it's going before the Supreme Court, and they have cases going on in Alabama and Tennessee and different places. But it really is a state-by-state thing.
Well, look, thank God we've got organisations like yours, which I didn't mention, your LGBT Courage Coalition, quite a young organisation.
We are. We just formed last year, yeah.
Well, congratulations and thanks again for all the work.
Yeah.
Just going to move on to questions from the audience, but before that, I just want to say that Julie's got to leave for a train about like 12:45. So thanks so much for coming and
Thank you.
fitting us in, because it's been a fantastic outside. So I'm going to ask us to have anyone got any questions for Julie in particular, just in case you have to leave the stage. Oh, this lady over here, one question. Do we have a mic, please? Thank you. And then questions from anyone in the panel after that. Just want to be.
The question for Julie that I want to ask is, there are so many of us here. What can we do? What do you see that we can do in terms of taking things forward from the experience that you have?
Well, anyone that can speak out should speak out, because there are some that can't. And for legitimate reasons. I used to get emails constantly from people who could have spoken out, but said they couldn't because somebody wouldn't like them if they did, or they might have a bit of hassle. And I'm talking about highly privileged people that weren't going to starve and that didn't have kids to protect. So they're the ones that can't speak out. Those of us that can speak out, we absolutely must. And it will change things immeasurably. Because we can see now, the last 20 years, how things have changed. It was pure hell, and it was terrifying, and now it's a bit less so. So that's what we should do.
And for newspapers, what's the best? Just write. And what's the best way of speaking out? Just keep writing to them when they see something's wrong.
I think so. I mean, you may have seen the huge kerfuffle about the Guardian article by Stuart Jeffries, in which he appeared to feel sympathy for Hamas. And wherever you sit on this issue, this horrendous, horrendous war, it was quite beyond belief. And somebody linked it to the decision to have Bin Laden writing an op-ed for The Guardian while the bodies still hadn't been collected from the Twin Towers all those years ago. And so make a fuss, make a scene, complain, 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 as Kath has said. But the problem is that what we don't want, well, speaking personally, what I don't want is articles to be removed. This is just not the way to do it, because this is just bullying tactics and capitulation. We want them to have proper values and proper journalistic values, which is telling a story, whether or not you like what that story is. So yeah, always point out, always complain. And unfortunately at the moment, the reader's editor's office at The Guardian is inhabited by someone who is not exactly with us on this issue. Let me just say that. And so sometimes you have to make threats to get them to move their arses.
Thank you, Julie. So just opening up, any questions for anyone else in the panel? The gentleman over there.
Thank you. Neil McCauley from LGB Alliance Canada.
Yay!
Not Canada. First off, Julie, I want to thank you for Vancouver Rape Relief, the work you did. Most Canadians were not aware of the story as it truly was. The way it was framed in the press didn't talk about the dead animals that were actually nailed to the door, the death threats. I only learned about that years later, and now I support them and encourage my friends to do so as well. I wanted to say that Canada, there's a lot of reasons why Canada is the way it is right now, but I do think a big part of it is a warning for state funding of media. So the Canadian government funds a lot of Canadian media. I mean, some publications, I think it's next year, the Montreal Gazette will be 100% funded by the Canadian government. Because, it's hard being a journalist now, the loss of incomes, online competition, whatnot. But the problem is, if your media is funded by the government, what if that government happens to be, well, what they call progressive? And what if that government is very easy to point the finger and say that's hateful speech because they're listening to the activists? Well, effectively it's state-controlled media.
Yeah.
And I believe that Canadians have been gaslit, lied to, and kept in the dark about this. They just don't know. But they are waking up to this reality. You have governments that are, provincial governments that are now trying to make it law that parents are aware that if their children change their pronouns, that they have to be told. And now, if you look at the mainstream media in Canada, all the pundits are saying how crazy this is. This is far right. Well, funny enough, the polling numbers show the overwhelming majority of Canadians think that this is the way to go. Yeah. They can't explain it. So it is changing. People don't trust things the way they used to. But I just wanted to say this.
No, that's really useful. And thank you for all your work you're doing in Canada. It really must be exhausting.
It is, but thank you. I'm so inspired. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Any more questions from the audience? This lady here, what's your name?
Hi, this is a question for Kath. Thank you so much for coming and for everything you've done, Kath. I wanted to ask, I've heard that a problem at the BBC and perhaps in other media organisations is when cuts are introduced, they're very much in middle management, and that this will sometimes lead to particular departments being dominated by 20-somethings and 30-somethings. That sounds like a very difficult, if it is true, I don't know if you would confirm that, it's a kind of a difficult problem to reverse. As soon as you get cuts, they tend to be, to produce this sort of imbalance in the age group that's controlling.
Yes. Yeah, it's true. I would say that quite a lot of the advocacy or gender believers at the BBC, like they genuinely believe in gender identity, are actually of a kind of middle-aged bent. There are a lot of, I wouldn't say the majority, I would say there are a lot of them there, and there are in leadership positions. But certainly when we had cuts about a year ago, we lost all of our legal and crime correspondents, and we retained a luxury team on LGBT. We retained Lauren Moss and Josh Parry, and now, so this was a very difficult to understand at a time when they were cutting so much money and there was supposed to be no money, but at the same time they weren't doing any stories. So I'm not going to criticise Lauren and Josh personally, but the stories weren't being done, shall we say. And so, in effect, that department acted as a kind of gatekeeper for... So the stories lie across politics, health, education, everything. We know that. But because it's such a sort of troubled remit, they would all be batted off to identity, and then the stories wouldn't get done. So that partnership is kind of dissolved now. So that gatekeeping element has stopped. So we should see some change coming soon. So now a lot more of it is going to fall into a new person has been given sort of the role, the social affairs editor, to do a lot of gender stories, but they will be also across politics, across health, and it'll a much broader spread. And in those departments, you have older people, you have, younger people. I think it's something of a mistake to say it's all young people who are pushing this, because there is the problem of one's personal contacts, family contacts, which Helen Joyce has spoken about, which can lead to an advocacy position. And
let's put that very politely.
But
people who might have children.
So, and also you've got the dinner party problem. In all legacy media circles, you've got the dinner party problem, because, if a senior leader puts their name on an email to say, we're not going to self-ID anymore in the Star Guide, he's going to be like, or she's going to be at an award ceremony or a dinner party, or, they're going to be asked by a bubble social circle, why did you do this?
But you see things...
So I think it's not necessarily an age thing, sorry.
No, you're saying you're seeing things get gradually better. That sounds like good progress.
I think things, yes.
So the identity unit, is that sort of...
It's
Or
still
losing its
there. It's
power.
called learning and identity, but it doesn't. But it doesn't have the same. This was its job.
overview of
This was its job to do all gender issues. That doesn't happen anymore. So it can go to different places, and also, not everybody at the BBC is like this. So there are some, one particular. If you think about how Mermaids was ejected in 2019, and I think Stonewall in 2020. So somebody was responsible for that, and that person is high up, and so, and that person is still there. So there are people of great principle, journalists of great principle at the BBC still, so, and they're not young, so yeah, I think things are getting better.
They're doing their bit. We'll have to keep
Yes,
going.
yes.
We might have time for just one more question. No, sorry, if it's quick, I might have two, but...
Hi there. I just wondered, talking about Stonewall Mermaids and the influence of GLAAD in the States, one of the ways in which these organisations managed to manipulate media companies like the BBC was by demanding that institutions set up a staff group that would represent our interests. And I wonder, is it time for us, as a wider gay movement or whatever, to say, you know what, we're perfectly well represented by being there. They're not homophobic. Let's close down those stupid pride groups.
Yeah. I think that's something we can all agree with, Malcolm. Might have time for just one last question. Microphone, please. Just at the top, the very end.
Get my exercise.
Hello. Kate Grimes spoke last year in the context of the NHS as first female hospital porter, chief executive, and I was really galvanised by what she had to say about the public sector equality duty. Listening to what you had to say about the BBC, maybe I'm ignorant. Is the BBC beholden to the public sector equality duty, or are there similar bits of legislation in place?
No, yes. I mean, and all sorts of safeguarding legislation as well. The problem is they don't see, for example, they think they've fulfilled it. It's like a brain fog. It's like a lack of understanding on what is real and what the whole thing is. It's uniquely for journalism. I think Ben will probably agree with this. It is seen as a subject where there are no truths, there are only competing arguments. Mm. Yeah. And there is an absolute failure of journalistic leadership to grasp the fact that there are indisputable truths here and they should be the default. The facts are seen as opinions and therefore biased, and in fact, BBC, the lie of sex change, opposite sex identification, is seen as impartial. It couldn't be more topsy-turvy. Mm-hmm. So there is, and sort of HR is very captured, diversity is very captured. And when I say captured, I mean with gender belief. I'm not saying that they're necessarily activists or bad people. You know, there is gender belief there, and it's very difficult to fight against it. And it leaks into editorial. So there is a, I mean, what can I say? I tried to sort of set up a sex equity network, and I was told that doesn't suit us. Now, you'd think along all the kind of equality, discrimination law, it just takes somebody to take a case. It's hard. I should have done, but I didn't. But it takes somebody, it's like a civil law rather than a criminal law, so it's hard to progress.
Thank you. Look, we have run out of time, I'm afraid. I just want to thank all my panel, excellent panel. And I just want to do a general big thank you for all of those people, including yourselves, lots of journalists, for sounding the alarm. So I'm going to ask Kate Harris, who you might know, to come onto the stage just to finish with a little tribute. Here comes Ms. Harris.
I came up the steps one leg at a time, thank you, Rona. I'm so sorry, everybody. It's 5-1, and I've only just got on the stage. I do have another apology. Beverly Jackson was up at 2 o'clock this morning baking oat cookies for the coffee break. Beverly is not a native of London. She comes from Barcelona. She decided to try a new courier company to pick up the cookies this morning. It was called Short Haul Internal Transport. It seems to be related to some legal firm, I think run by a Mr. Morm. The courier company didn't turn up, so I'm afraid, once again, Mr. Morm is responsible for bringing misery to LGB Alliance, and I'm very, very sorry to all of you, but it's not Beverly's fault, it's Jolien Morm's. And now back to the serious discussion that we've been having today. I hope you can all hear me. Yes. The journalists that have been on the panel and that we've all followed over the years deserve our heartfelt thanks. Even before LGB Alliance came into existence, we relied on a very few voices to tell the truth. I'm going to read out some names of journalists to whom we will ever be grateful because they risked their careers, they risked being laughed at, they risked their paychecks, they risked their reputations. But like Kath, like Julie, and like the ones I'm going to name, we owe them a massive debt of gratitude. I'm not remotely surprised to say a lot of them are Scottish. We have so many Scottish people in LGB Alliance. I don't know why. I suppose because it is the home of the Enlightenment, despite everything that Nicola Sturgeon and her gangster friends have tried to do to that country. I'm not going to ask you to applaud each one, although you may whoop if necessary. We can give them a big round of applause at the end. If I have missed anybody out and you're here, stand up and shout out your name. But here is the list that I have, and some of these people are with us today. Alex Massey, Amelia Gentlewoman, Andrew Doyle, Bernard Lane, Brendan O'Neill, Dave Hewitt, Douglas Murray, Ella Whelan, Ewan McColm, Gina Davidson, Hadley Freeperson, Hannah Barnes, Hayley Dixon, James Kirkup, Janice Turner, Jenny Murray, Joe Bartosh, Joan McAlpine, Joan Smith, Joanna Williams, Julia Hartley Brewer, Julie Bindel, Julie Burchill, Kevin McKenna, Mandy Rhodes, Malcolm Clark, Marion Scott, Shona Craven, Sonia Soda, Stephen Daisley, Susan Dalgetty, Suzanne Moore. I know that Susan, Sonia, and Joe are here today. Please stand up, and any other of those I've named, please stand up, and let's give them an enormous vote of gratitude. Susan, you didn't stand up for long enough. Stand up. Susan Dalgetty, Joe Bartosh, Sonia Soda, and anybody else. Thank you. Cool.